That Thursday morning in late October, I drove myself to Sunnybrook Health Sciences Centre in Toronto to sign what my brother-in-law had called routine paperwork. He'd phoned me the night before, his voice steady and practiced, explaining that the doctors needed a family signature to move my younger sister into palliative care. "It's what she would have wanted," he said. "You know how she felt about suffering." I believed him. God help me, I believed him. Have you ever stood at a crossroads where every instinct you possess is screaming one thing, but the people around you, the doctors, the administrators, the man your sister chose to marry, are all calmly pointing you in the opposite direction? That was me, 63 years old, standing in a hospital corridor in my Goodwill coat with a pen in my hand, absolutely certain I was about to do something I could never take back. My sister's name is Lorraine. She is 58 years old. She taught elementary school for 26 years in Scarborough before she retired. She makes the best butter tarts in the province. She volunteers every Christmas at the food bank on Danforth Avenue. And she has laughed at my terrible jokes since we were small girls, sharing a bedroom in our parents' house in Hamilton. She was admitted to Sunnybrook 4 days earlier after collapsing in her kitchen. Her husband, I'll call him my brother-in-law because that's all he deserves from me now, had called the ambulance, explained she'd had a fall, and by the time I arrived at the hospital that first afternoon, she was unconscious and attached to a ventilator. The neurologist on her case told me she had sustained a severe brain injury. He spoke calmly with that particular kind of distance that some physicians develop, and he said the prognosis was not good. Not good. He used those exact words. He said she might never regain consciousness. He recommended we begin thinking about next steps. My brother-in-law nodded along to everything, squeezing my hand, his face arranged into the correct shape of grief. I signed nothing that first day. I told them I needed time. My brother-in-law walked me to the parking garage. He said he understood. He said, "Of course, you need time." He said we could sort out the paperwork the following week, but 3 days later, he was calling me again, and this time his voice had an edge underneath the sympathy, something impatient, something that wanted this finished. He said the doctors were advising it. He said prolonging things was only causing Lorraine more distress. He said, "You're the one she gave power of attorney to, which means you're the one who has to do the right thing here." That part was true. Lorraine had given me her medical power of attorney 8 years ago during a practical-minded phase after our mother died. She'd sat at my kitchen table in Mississauga with a notary she'd found online, and she'd been very clear she did not want to be kept alive by machines if there was no reasonable hope of recovery. I had signed as her agent. I had taken the responsibility seriously. So, I drove to Sunnybrook that Thursday morning, believing I was honoring my sister's wishes. I was doing the right thing. I was being a good sister. I found the forms waiting for me at the nursing station on the 4th floor. A young woman at the desk, who couldn't have been more than 25, handed me a clipboard with a small, tight smile. I took it to a chair near the window. The papers were several pages long. Medical language I only half understood. I found the signature lines at the bottom. I uncapped my pen. "Excuse me." The voice came from just to my left. I looked up and there was a woman, perhaps 30 years old, in scrubs with the kind of exhausted face that tells you someone has been working a very long shift. Her name tag read Deborah. She was a registered nurse, 4th floor. She was looking at me the way you look at someone who is standing too close to the edge of something. "Are those the withdrawal of life support forms?" she said very quietly. I told her yes. She glanced toward the nursing station, then back at me. She sat down in the chair beside mine without being invited. "I'm sorry to intrude," she said. "I know this isn't my place, but I need you to please not sign those yet." She paused. "Can you give me 15 minutes? Just 15 minutes before you sign anything." I looked at her. I looked at the clipboard. I thought about my brother-in-law waiting for a call, confirming it was done. "Why?" I said. She leaned in slightly. "Because I've been your sister's nurse since she was admitted, and there are things about this case that are bothering me. Things I flagged to my charge nurse. Things I don't think you know." She wasn't dramatic about it. She wasn't whispering in some Hollywood fashion. She was just a tired, serious young woman who looked like she was doing something that frightened her very much and had decided to do it anyway. That's what made me listen, not theatrics. Just someone quietly choosing to do the right thing when it would have been far easier to mind her own business. I put the cap back on my pen. I said, "Tell me." Deborah had been assigned to Lorraine's care from the first night. She told me that in her experience, for years in neurology, 2 of them in intensive care, patients with Lorraine's type of injury showed a particular pattern on their monitoring data, gradual deterioration over a consistent arc. What she was seeing in Lorraine's charts wasn't quite matching that pattern. Lorraine's numbers had stabilized in a way that seemed inconsistent with the severity of injury described in the admitting report. She had raised it with the attending neurologist, a man I'll call the neurologist, because naming him feels like giving him something he doesn't deserve. The neurologist had dismissed her concern. He'd said the variations were within normal parameters. He'd said she was a nurse, not a physician, and that her job was patient care, not diagnosis. She had then done something that at another job might have ended her career. She had quietly requested access to the ward's overnight monitoring records and compared them against the original assessment. What she found was that Lorraine's baseline brain activity, the thing that had been described to me as consistent with a non-survivable injury, was not in fact static. There were fluctuations, small ones that the neurologist's official notes did not mention. Deborah was not telling me my sister was going to recover. She was very careful about that. She was telling me that the picture being presented to me, the picture that had led me to that chair with that pen, might not be the complete picture. And then she showed me her phone. She had, 2 days earlier, been on her break in the parking structure when she saw my brother-in-law having an argument with a man she didn't recognize. She'd noticed because the man was pressing something into my brother-in-law's hand, an envelope, and my brother-in-law had looked around in a way that you look around when you don't want to be seen. Deborah had not thought much of it at the time, but when she came to work the following morning and found orders had been signed to begin withdrawal of life support within 72 hours, she had started paying closer attention. She had then gone to a hospital security officer she trusted, a woman who had worked at Sunnybrook for 15 years, and described what she'd seen. The security officer had checked the parking structure camera footage. She had found the exchange on camera, and she had quietly and on her own initiative flagged it to hospital administration. The footage showed my brother-in-law and the neurologist. Not a man Deborah didn't recognize. The neurologist. The man who had told me my sister would not recover. The man whose official reports had formed the entire basis for the next steps conversation. The man who had dismissed Deborah's concerns about inconsistent monitoring data. I sat in that chair by the window for a long moment after she finished speaking. I could hear the sounds of the ward around me, the soft chiming of equipment, someone's television down the hall, my own breathing. "Is she going to die?" I said. "If I don't sign those papers right now, is she going to die?" "No," Deborah said. "She is stable. She is on the ventilator, but she is stable. No one can remove that ventilator without your consent. You have power of attorney. That signature is the only thing that authorizes withdrawal of support. So if I don't sign, then nothing changes. Not today." I put the clipboard face down on the chair beside me. I took out my phone and called my nephew in Oakville, Lorraine's son from her first marriage, who is 31 and works in finance and has always been, thank God, extremely practical in a crisis. I told him to drive to Sunnybrook immediately. I told him not to call his stepfather first. He didn't ask questions. He was there in 40 minutes. What unfolded over the next 72 hours was something I will spend a very long time processing. Hospital administration, once Deborah's flag had been escalated, had already quietly contacted the Ontario Provincial Police. The parking structure footage was not the only thing they had found. A review of the neurologist's recent case files, prompted by the security officer's report, had turned up 2 other cases in the preceding 8 months in which his assessments of brain injury severity had been strikingly more pessimistic than those of consulting physicians. Both patients had died after life support withdrawal. Both deaths had been signed off as natural. Both patients had spouses or partners who stood to collect significant life insurance payouts. In Lorraine's case, my brother-in-law had taken out a supplemental life insurance policy on her 14 months before her collapse. The payout was $480,000. She had collapsed in her kitchen. He had called the ambulance. He had told the paramedics she had fallen. What he had not mentioned, what showed up in the toxicology screening that was ordered when police became involved, was that Lorraine had traces of a sedative compound in her bloodstream that was consistent with ingestion in the hours before her collapse. A compound not prescribed to her, a compound that at a sufficient dose could cause exactly the kind of sudden neurological event that had landed her in Sunnybrook. She had not fallen. She had been given something, and she had lost consciousness, and he had called it a fall. The neurologist, when confronted, initially denied everything. He lasted approximately 90 minutes under questioning before his lawyer advised him to stop talking. He had received $60,000 deposited across 3 transactions into an account held in his wife's maiden name. In exchange, his assessments of Lorraine's brain activity had been systematically understated. He had in his clinical notes described her as presenting with characteristics she did not in fact present with. He had dismissed Deborah's observations because Deborah had noticed the discrepancy. My brother-in-law was arrested at the home he shared with my sister, the home in North York that she had owned before she married him, on a Friday afternoon, 2 days after I put the cap back on my pen. Lorraine did not wake up the following Tuesday with a clear head and full memory the way people do in films. Recovery from what was done to her has been slow and difficult and non-linear. There were weeks when I drove to Sunnybrook every single day and sat beside her bed and read to her from the novels she loves, Maeve Binchy, Alice Munro, anything with women who endure things and come out the other side. And there were other weeks when the progress seemed to stall and the doctors were careful in how they phrased things, and I had to sit with uncertainty in a way that I found genuinely very hard. But she is alive. She is home. She is not the same as she was before all of this. She gets tired more easily. She struggles with certain kinds of word retrieval. She has a physiotherapist who comes to the house twice a week. But she is home and she is making butter tarts again. And last month, she laughed at one of my terrible jokes in a way that sounded so exactly like herself that I had to leave the room so she wouldn't see me cry. My brother-in-law was charged with attempted murder, criminal negligence causing bodily harm, and fraud. The neurologist was charged with fraud, criminal negligence, and professional misconduct. The College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario has revoked his license. Both of their cases are making their way through the courts, which is slow and ugly, and a thing I am learning to hold alongside the relief. The insurance policy, needless to say, will not be paying out. I have thought a great deal about what would have happened if Deborah had not sat down beside me. If she had decided it was not her place, if she had weighed the professional risk, a nurse contradicting a neurologist, raising concerns about a case that had already been administratively signed off, and decided it wasn't worth it. She was a young woman in her first real job in a competitive field. She had every practical reason in the world to mind her own business. She told me later that she had almost not said anything. She had stood at the nursing station watching me walk to that chair, and she had gone back and forth in her head for a full 2 minutes. She said what finally decided her was thinking about what she would tell herself afterward if she'd stayed quiet. I think about that a lot. There is something I want to say about instinct, because I think it gets dismissed in the way that things associated with women and with age tend to get dismissed. When my brother-in-law called me that second time, the call with the impatient edge underneath the sympathy, something in me heard it. Not heard it the way you hear words, but heard it the way you hear a wrong note in a song you've known your whole life. Something was off. Something was not right. And I had been within one uncapped pen of overriding that knowledge with reasonableness, with deference, with a learned habit of trusting the official version of things. 63 years old and I almost didn't trust myself. I have had some hard conversations with myself about that since. There is also something I want to say about Lorraine's marriage, because the question I am asked most often by people who know what happened, by my nephew, by my own adult children, is how I didn't see it. The honest answer is that I saw parts of it. I saw that my brother-in-law managed their finances in a way that left Lorraine without easy access to her own accounts. I saw that when Lorraine and I made plans, he sometimes found reasons for them not to happen. I saw that at family gatherings, she watched him before she spoke, the way you watch someone whose reaction you can't quite predict. I saw these things and I filed them in a category I can only describe as concern I didn't fully examine, because she hadn't asked me to examine it, and because she was an adult, and because I think I was afraid of what I might find if I looked directly at it. I am looking directly at it now. Lorraine and I talk about it carefully, in the way that sisters talk about hard things, sideways sometimes, and then suddenly direct, and then sideways again. She is working through it with a counselor. I am working through my own version of it, which is smaller than hers but not nothing. We are both, I think, learning to trust the versions of ourselves that saw the wrong note and now refuse to stay quiet about it. My nephew, who is practical and good, and who drove to Sunnybrook in 40 minutes without asking questions, has handled a great deal of the legal and financial complexity on Lorraine's behalf. He is 31 years old, and he stepped into something very adult and very ugly with a steadiness that made me proud in a way I didn't have words for at the time. And Deborah, I sent her flowers twice and wrote her a letter that took me 4 drafts to get right, and it still didn't say what I wanted it to say. She was nominated for a Hospital Excellence Award this past spring. She won it. I went to the ceremony. I sat in the 3rd row, and I did not try to leave the room before she could see me cry. Here is what I know at 63 that I did not know at 40: the people who are supposed to be in charge are not always trustworthy. And the instinct that tells you something is wrong is not hysteria. And the hardest thing is not making the difficult decision, the hardest thing is refusing to make the easy one. I almost signed those papers. I had the pen in my hand. And every single good thing that has happened since, Lorraine at her kitchen table, the butter tarts, the terrible joke, the sound of her laughing like herself, every bit of that exists because one exhausted young nurse sat down beside a stranger and chose to say something when it would have been so much simpler to say nothing. If something feels wrong, trust that it feels wrong. Find your Deborah. Be someone else's Deborah. I'll see you in the next story. I've been thinking about cause and effect a lot lately. Not in any grand or philosophical sense, just the plain ordinary version of it that you start to see clearly when you get older and you've lived through enough things to trace the line between a choice and its consequences. My brother-in-law made a series of choices. He chose to marry Lorraine. He chose to take out that insurance policy 14 months before she collapsed. He chose to give her something that night in the kitchen. He chose to call it a fall. And then he chose to phone me with that practiced, steady voice and tell me I was doing the right thing, the kind thing, the thing she would have wanted. Every one of those choices was deliberate. Every one of them pointed in the same direction, and the whole structure of it, the careful, patient architecture of what he built, would have held together if one exhausted young nurse on the 4th floor of a hospital in Toronto hadn't decided that staying quiet was something she couldn't live with. That's the thing about choices. They don't just belong to the person making them. They ripple. His choices rippled into Lorraine's life in ways she's still untangling. Deborah's choice to sit down beside a stranger, to risk her career, to say the thing that needed saying rippled into all of ours in ways that are still unfolding. My nephew driving 40 minutes without asking questions, Lorraine at her kitchen table last month, me writing this, hoping it reaches someone who needs to hear it. I think about the version of that Thursday where I signed, where I capped my pen afterward and called my brother-in-law to tell him it was done, where I spent the rest of my life carrying that, not knowing what I'd actually done, or knowing eventually and having to figure out how to survive that knowledge. I think about it more than I probably should. It keeps me honest about something. Intelligence alone is not enough. I am not a foolish person. I am reasonably educated, reasonably experienced, reasonably good at reading situations. And I almost didn't read that one correctly because I deferred, because I trusted the official version. Because somewhere in my 63 years, I had learned to treat my own instincts as the thing that needed to be overridden when it came into conflict with authority. That is the habit I am working hardest to unlearn. The courage Deborah showed was not reckless. It was not dramatic. It was the quiet, specific courage of someone who had thought carefully about what she knew, weighed the cost of speaking against the cost of silence, and chosen the harder path. That kind of courage is available to all of us. It doesn't require a particular personality. It requires only that you take your own moral sense seriously enough to act on it. Even when acting is inconvenient, even when it puts something at risk, even when the people around you are pointing in the opposite direction. Lorraine is relearning things she knew before. Some days that is slow and frustrating for her, but she is doing it with stubbornness and humor and the specific kind of resilience that I think comes from surviving something and understanding on the far side of it exactly how close it came. She doesn't waste much energy on bitterness, she spends it on recovery instead. That to me is the clearest kind of wisdom, knowing where to put your effort. If you are carrying something right now, a suspicion you keep dismissing, a situation that doesn't quite add up, a voice inside you that keeps raising its hand, I want you to take it seriously. Not recklessly, not without thought, but seriously. The way Deborah took her observations seriously. The way I eventually took that wrong note in my brother-in-law's voice seriously. The things we notice are not nothing. They are data. They are worth examining. Trust the part of yourself that pays attention. It has been paying attention longer than you.